Thank you, George. Glad that the start ran late. You didn't have to be bored with the lengthy introduction. My plan is first to say a little bit about public attitudes towards Social Security, then a few facts on Social Security just to put it in context. Then I'll dip into history starting in 1972. I first got involved in Social Security on a panel for House Ways and Means in 1974. Been at it on and off ever since, depending on how hot the topic is. And then I'll get to what the title is, my view on the likely outcomes for the future of Social Security. So here's the first one. This is asked to young people, and do you think the system will pay you a benefit, which has been interpreted by them, and I spoke with junior colleagues back when this was a hot topic, as in no benefit is zero. So as you see, a large fraction of young people think it's zero. It's a rather ill-informed conclusion because the payroll tax revenue that's dedicated for Social Security goes to Social Security. And unless the payroll tax disappears or gets transferred to some other subject, there will be a flow of revenue to finance benefits for the indefinite future. And it seems to me very unlikely that that would disappear. Turning to older people, do you think you'll continue getting full benefits? Rather large fraction of people of Social Security age think the answer is yes. And as I will indicate, by the time I get to the end, I think the answer is no. Once the crisis becomes relevant, I'd be very surprised if full benefits continued. They didn't continue through the 1983 crisis. They set off with the 1977 reform, extended push by what were called the notch babies, complaining that their benefits were cut. So I don't think that's a relevant one. And the third and last of these images of surveys, the message here is not the horse race between the two, but the point that if it's all or nothing one way or the other, the country is quite split. There are a lot of people who just want to raise taxes as the first choice. It doesn't answer the question how they feel about a mix. And a lot of people who, if it's all going to be on one side, just want to cut benefits. So that's part of the background when you think of the political process, the political parties, and the voters who support them. Turning to Social Security, one of the first facts is it's not a huge amount of money for the bulk of people. It makes a big dent in elderly poverty. It makes a big dent in living standards, but it's not huge, and indeed, by the international standards of advanced countries, we have one of the lowest tax rates, not the lowest, but one of the lowest. And consistent with that, we have a relatively low replacement rate of benefits relative to earnings. The system is deliberately progressive. It gives a larger replacement rate, more benefits relative to your history of earnings for lower earners than high earners. And as you can see, there's a large difference between the rates on this three-piece linear benefit formula. And you see the breakpoints come in. So there aren't a whole lot of people who just get that 90%. Most people, you get 90% of that, and then you get 32% of what's next. And then for the top earners, they're not getting a whole lot for their additional taxes up on the top. Taxes, I'm sure everybody is familiar with that. And every year, the top amount of earnings subject to tax goes up. It's indexed to the average wage in the economy. So that's one of the indexing elements that was created in the 1977 law. I need some help. Age distribution, the bulk of the benefits do go to retirees, not disabled, not children. And there's a wide range of ages. Obviously, the age distribution is going to be shifting as the baby boomers get older, but that's the picture. So this is primarily a retirement benefit program. Actually, Social Security and disability have separate trust funds, but Congress has never hesitated about moving money between the two trust funds. So the common practice is to refer to the system as a whole and just add up the two trust funds and treat it as one. This is slightly out of date because for some odd reason it didn't appear in the 2018 report. Fast facts and figures about Social Security is on the web, on the Social Security website. It comes out every year. It's packed with information about both Social Security and SSI. A version of this has appeared annually. For some reason, it's not in the latest. As you can see, the reliance of older people on Social Security is huge. They're understandably very sensitive to it. And for a shockingly large fraction, it's practically everything they've got. So of course, there's great sensitivity about it. And you can tell the contrast between married couples and individuals who are not married, and of course, overwhelmingly, that's widows. So issues about rethinking how we treat widows is always on the political agenda. Now, how does it come about that we have so great reliance? The issue is the rest of the pension system, the employer-provided plans, the individual IRAs and the like. They don't generate an enormous amount of retirement income throughout the income distribution. So this is a survey asking people, do you have, are you participating now in an employer-sponsored pension? And the answer typically is about 50%. With surveys like this, that's not necessarily a precise estimate, but it's ballpark accurate as far as anyone can tell. And the trend, or the lack of trend, is something where whatever biases there are in the individual answer are probably the same year after year. So the trend is, in a sense, more reliable. There is one study I'm aware of where a couple of economists pulled out all the W-2 tax records. So if you've got a 401k, it shows up in your tax records, assuming your employer filed the W-2 properly, which has a very high accuracy rate. And so the first thing is nearly 80% of workers have the opportunity to contribute to a 401k. The employer may be contributing something as well, maybe not. But less than half of them actually contributed. And there's another 10% that still have the traditional defined benefit plan. So you can see there are lots of gaps I haven't pulled up numbers on IRAs, but that has a similar picture. So here's the picture you've probably seen. It's from the annual report of the trustees of Social Security. This is done by the Office of the Chief Actuary. And they do 3 projections of the finances of Social Security for the next 75 years. Every year, 1 year becomes history, and another year is added on the end. So they're always doing 75 years. And they calculate what would happen under current law. So the dark line, first of all, the almost horizontal line is revenue. That's mostly payroll tax revenue and a little bit of revenue from the income taxation of benefits. And the solid line is the total amount to be spent on benefits year by year. It goes up as more and more baby boomers retire. It goes up as earnings move up a bit. But by law, Social Security doesn't borrow. When the trust fund hits 0, the amount spent on benefits cannot exceed the amount coming in tax revenues. So at that point, which they thought would happen in 2034, you get a 21% benefit cut for everybody. The law doesn't stipulate that, but back in '83, when we came very close to that happening, just uniform cut for everybody is the way the planning was going. So that's the hard line, and then the dotted line is how much it would cost to pay all the benefits that are in the calculation referred to as scheduled benefits. And as you can see, beyond 2034, slightly larger benefit cuts year by year as the population ages, but it doesn't change a whole lot. It doesn't fall off the cliff. Referring to this as bankruptcy is likely to mislead people, as has certainly happened in the past. Now they do 3 projections just to give a sense, well, if everything breaks well or if everything breaks badly. I don't find that a particularly good way of getting the sense of, well, you know, this is a projection. It doesn't guarantee that it will happen. But both the Office of the Actuary and the Congressional Budget Office set up stochastic models and simulate them. And of course, they don't know exactly the probability distribution of future rates of return on the Treasury bonds they're holding or growth of wages. Those elements come in, but they've set up the best empirical model they can. And this calculation says, looking year by year, what fraction of our simulations have the trust fund hitting 0? So they say it's very unlikely to happen. This is, again, a couple of years old. CBO hasn't done it again since then, at least as far as I've been able to find it. And the figure from the Office of the Actuary I find is less instructive. So unlikely to be a problem for a while, and then unlikely to be a problem, and then rapidly becoming very likely to be a problem, and unlikely to last beyond some point in the early 2030s. So this, to my mind, is to be taken very seriously. And the issue is, what are we going to do about this program as it heads for and finally reaches the point where the trust fund is 0. Not literally 0, because there's money coming in every month, but you know what I mean. What's available is small. So let me turn now to history, because if we want a sense of the likelihood on politics, looking at what's happened with the history makes sense. So the story starts in 1972. Up until 1972, Social Security had no automatics. Congress would vote changes in the benefit formula from time to time. Congress would vote changes in the payroll tax rate. Congress usually put in place a future payroll tax increase. So from the beginning of the system, where they knew costs would be rising as more people would become beneficiaries, they legislated future tax rate increases. There was always a future tax rate increase on the books from the beginning until 1990. We haven't had one since then. None of them were ever canceled. Some of them were delayed, and congressmen would commonly say, I'll see you don't get a tax increase. But when it came to crunch, the tax increases happened as needed to keep the system going. So in the 60s, as inflation was picking up, the need to adjust benefits for inflation was present year after year, or every couple of years. And when you do something on the benefits side, you got to pay for it, because the tradition in Social Security is to balance over 75 years. So they'd be raising taxes, raising benefits. To begin with, congressmen went home and were greeted warmly and thanked for the benefit increases. Once people got used to them, congressmen would go home and people would say, why was the benefit increase so small? My cost of living is up a lot more than this. And it also was obviously very time consuming for Congress to have the annual struggle or biennial struggle on what to change. So Congress asked Social Security actuary to design a law which would do what Congress in practice did automatically, so they wouldn't have to do it. So in 1972, that law came into effect. The system was not properly indexed for inflation. The Office of the Actuary knew this from the moment they designed what Congress had asked for. This was communicated to Congress. There was a hearing before the Senate Finance Committee when Senator Roth of the Roth IRA said to the chief actuary, and it was a brand new chief actuary, I'm told the system is not correctly indexed. Is that a problem? And the chief actuary said, at the inflation rates the U.S. has had historically, recent years, this will not be a long-run financing problem. 1972 was a terrible time to rely on inflation not getting out of hand. So as inflation went up in the 70s, Social Security got into a bigger and bigger hole as benefits rose and the revenues weren't keeping pace with it because the indexing wasn't done right. So the problem was big. I'll show you a couple of numbers in a moment, and getting worse year by year. And it was clear Congress needed a new system, and there was an extended debate, congressional committees working on it themselves, some commissions appointed, not to bring something in like the Greenspan Commission did, but to lay out the issues around different designs. And in '77, we basically created the current system. Looking at that in the '77 trustees report before the reform, the Office of the Actuary said, if you want to last 75 years under the current law, then current law, you have to increase the payroll tax rate by 8.2%. That was a big problem. They did a reform. It was too big to deal with all of it, but they dealt with most of it. So the next year's trustees report said, looking ahead 75 years, we still need 1.4, but that's a lot less. And what's more, it won't be rising the way the other one did in a dramatic fashion. Moreover, at that point, they didn't see a problem in the short run. They didn't see a problem in the short run because the baby boomers were entering the labor force, And that was generating revenue that would eventually lead to benefits, but in terms of a cash flow basis, they didn't see a problem. But they were wrong, as you no doubt remember, those of you of my age or so. The economy went very bad. We got a serious recession. And so what happened was in the 1982 trustees report, the Office of the Actuary said, here are the annual revenue deficits. They do go away as the baby boomers cut in, but we've got to do something to get through the years out to 1989. And what's more, we've got to do it in a hurry because the trust fund will hit zero this summer, July, I always forget which month, and everybody will get a benefit cut. And what's more, it takes us several months to program the computers that print out the checks. So we've got to get a reform in March, or we will be cutting the checks, giving everybody a benefit cut. And yes, you could make it up afterwards, but you'll have a lot of angry people getting small checks. So Congress went to work on this, and as I'm sure many of you are aware, the Greenspan Commission was appointed. It had 15 members, 5 appointed by each House of Congress and 5 appointed by the administration. Each group was a mix of Democrats and Republicans, but the Democrats appointed by the White House were the White House's choice, unlike the Democrats and Republicans that were the minority party in the 2 houses. Their leadership got to pick who was there. So the familiar story is they came up with a fairly balanced plan for the short run, for 83 to 89. Familiar things, new federal employees came into Social Security that had been out. Nonprofit employees came in mandatorily, they had been out. Up till then, state and local employees were in or out at the choice of the state. And what was happening as Social Security got into trouble is states that were in started to pull out. So they said, you can't do that anymore. If you've been in, you're in to stay. Then looking at beneficiaries, they delayed the cost of living adjustment by 6 months. They didn't do it just once, they did that on a permanent basis. So every year for half the year, you get a smaller benefit than you would have had without the delay. I'm inclined to refer to that as a benefit cut. And that's when they introduced income taxation of benefits, which again reduced elements. There were some benefit increases targeted on the poorest people most reliant on Social Security. That's a common practice with reforms. And then they took the future payroll tax increase that was on the books and moved it earlier to get revenue when they needed it before the baby boomers kicked in. And they changed the way self-employed were taxed to match how employees were taxed. And that was a further increase. So fairly balanced package, that's what happened. Life was more complicated for dealing with the long-run problem. This was big enough in their projection and accurately to deal with the short-run problem, but the 75-year balance wasn't going to be hit. And sometime in this century, Social Security was projected to hit zero again. So they couldn't agree on what to do. And so what happened is they decided on a process rather than settling it with the leadership. And so first, House Ways and Means put a bill on the floor that basically was half increasing the age for full benefits and half increasing tax rates. And you could see way out in the future from 1983. This was not politically a hot button item. And the rule that the Rules Committee put down was there will be 2 amendments proposed. We'll have the House Ways and Means bill, we'll have an amendment proposed, we'll have a second amendment proposed. If they both fail, House Ways and Means bill. If one of them passes and bumps the other one, that's the law. So, and the 2 members of Congress, one conservative, one very liberal, were told to design the 2 amendments. They were both Democrats, but Southern Democrats were pretty conservative. So J.J. Pickle, who was very active in Social Security, but fiscally conservative, went for increasing the age for full benefits, which, as I'll explain in a moment, is basically a benefit cut phased in. And the Republicans liked it a lot. The Democrats didn't like it, but the Republicans outvoted. And then Claude Pepper from Florida went to bump that and replace it by a tax rate increase, again, way down the road. The Republicans didn't like that at all. The Democrats were fairly split on the tax rate increase, and so we got the benefit cut, which is the current law, which, as you know, has gone to 66 and is in the process of going to 67. So why do I refer to increasing the age for full benefits as a benefit cut? This is drawn not over that bill, but of commonly made proposals to deal with finances now, which is to change the age from 67 to 70. So say you retire at some age. We'll say the law is 67, and you're retiring at 67, then you get 100% of what comes out of the formula based on your earnings history. If the age for full benefits were 70, instead of 100%, you only get 80%. You get 20% less than you would have under the previous law. I don't see any way to refer to that. People like to talk about it as, oh, it's the retirement age. People will live longer and work longer. But however you do it, you're going to get less than you would have gotten otherwise. So now I'm turning to the topic of the title, the future of Social Security. Will we get those benefit cuts, or will we get legislation? I'm very confident that, as in '83, Congress isn't going to have everybody get a smaller check than they've been used to. The politics around that seem so lethal that, yes, we have seen threats to not pay on the national debt by not raising the debt limit, but that didn't happen despite the threats, and I think the same thing goes here. My view is we will get legislation. When will we get legislation? Well, keep in mind, there's nothing but bad news in fixing this problem. Either you cut benefits or you raise taxes, and either one makes somebody unhappy, and sometimes both of them make somebody unhappy. So if Congress doesn't have to do it right away, and there isn't a big push for some reason to do it right away, it seems to me it won't happen. Last minute, it seems to me, is inevitable. What's the picture look like as we look forward? Well, right now, this is again a year out of date, because this is somebody's simulations and I don't have the ability to update. We'd have to raise the payroll tax rate by just under 3 percentage points in order to say we're good for 75 years. That number keeps creeping up, reaching 4. This is a lot smaller than I showed you for 77, and it's also growing more slowly than 77. Smaller says it's easier. Growing slower means there isn't a whole lot of pressure to deal with it. And what about the deficits? Does that look like what we did in '83, where we got a short-run problem, but lots of time for dealing with a long problem? Nope. The deficits get bigger and bigger and stay big. So this is a tough problem, which seems to me to make it very hard to do anything before the last minute. And how will we do it? Well, some people say 83, we waited till the last minute and it was okay. We formed a commission, the commission fixed it. We'll do the same thing again. The trouble with that is it's historically inaccurate. Robert Ball was a member of the Greenspan Commission. He was working on his memoirs when he died in his mid-90s. He didn't quite finish them, but he had finished the part about the 83 reform, and that's since been published. And what happened is the commission was totally split. You form a commission to come up with a shared solution, which you then take to your principals. The principals at the time were President Reagan, who could speak for the Republican Party, and Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, who could get the Democrats lined up. The Senate was less of an issue. They were mostly going to go along with what came out of it. And so the job of the commission was to present a compromise solution to the two of them. The commission failed. So the two of them got together and said, let's us come up with a plan, not the two of them personally, and we'll take that to the commission and get the commission to agree with what we've come up with. And that's what happened. Robert Ball was Tip O'Neill's key person, could speak for Tip O'Neill, and James Baker could speak for President Reagan, and they had 4 or 5 other people. There are some lovely little stories about what went on. So yes, we can wait till 83, but don't think this will be an easy problem for some commission to solve. Evidence about that also comes from the history since 83. President Clinton, with an advisory council, asked them to come up with a plan, and he went around the country pushing the need to reform Social Security then. President Bush, as you know, wanted to privatize. He came up with a commission that came up with a plan. President Obama formed a commission together with the Republicans in Congress, and they came up with a plan. And you know exactly how much got legislated. Nothing. So what will determine, assuming I've got this right so far, the kind of compromise that will come out in 2033? It'll depend on the political alignment at the time, and I'm an economist. I don't predict the makeup of Congress in 15 years. But I will tell you the differences that come depending on the makeup of Congress. And I've heard from some people on the left, waiting till the last minute is just fine because it makes tax increases more politically viable than benefit cuts, because you can raise the tax a lot more without getting quite the backlash you get from cutting benefits. I think that's wrong, as I will explain in a moment. So, what about the two parties and their view? Sam Johnson, when he wrote this, and I think still, is the chairman of the Social Security Subcommittee of House Ways and Means. John Larson, ranking Democrat on Social Security Subcommittee of House Ways and Means. And each of them filed a plan with the Office of the Actuary. Again, you can go to the website. The Office of the Actuary takes a plan, spells it out, describes its effect year by year, and usually with some back and forth with the member of Congress proposing it, comes up with a plan that will give you the 75 years of coverage that is the target of having actuarial balance restored. So Sam Johnson's plan, no change in the payroll tax rate, no change in the payroll tax base. John Larson's plan, and he has, at the last count, 174 co-sponsors. Johnson apparently didn't go looking for co-sponsors, so there aren't any there. Increasing the payroll tax rate, series of steps, and that's the highest it gets to in 2042. And also taxing some of income that's above that maximum that I showed you earlier on. In particular, he'll jump up and start taxing at $400,000 and above, and then as the economy grows, eventually that now 128 will reach 400, and we'll have the whole system subject to tax. Now, how did Larson talk about this in his press release? The word tax increase didn't cross the printing press. Instead, he said, ensure Social Security remains strong well into the future. And let's look at the other side. Larson has a big tax increase because he wants to raise benefits. He thinks for many people they're too small. And so he wants larger benefits with a larger tax increase to pay for it. And as you can see, these are negative impacts on that 75-year actuarial balance because he's spending money on a better benefit formula, less taxation of benefits, a different cost of living adjustment that will go up faster, and some money for the special minimum. What does Sam Johnson do? Well, he's cutting benefits in terms of a change in the benefit formula. He's increasing the age for full benefits. That's another benefit cut. He does want to end the taxation of benefits. That's a benefit increase targeted on high earners. He wants, again, a different COLA than the one that's used now, one that will grow more slowly. He also wants to target on the poorest people a bit of an increase and some other peanuts. So how did Johnson talk about it? Did the word benefit cut appear anywhere in his press release? Of course not. Modernizing, updating, ensuring, targeting were all euphemisms for cutting benefits. So what are the options when we get there to 2033 and it's the last minute? One option is you make sharp changes in taxes and/or benefits. That is politically extremely unattractive, and my guess is it won't happen. So what could be done so that they can phase in changes slowly, and some of them are enough down the road that politically they're not the same kind of suicide? Well, there are two ways. You need money to do that. There are two ways to do it. I don't think we'll just get the Fed to print it and hand it over to Social Security. One way to do it is to just use general revenues, which is, let me say, a common practice in a number of the European countries. They don't keep their Social Security equivalent or similar kind of program solely out of the dedicated tax revenue. As needed, they move money in and out of general revenues. So that's one option. The other option is to let Social Security borrow from the Treasury, where the bill is required to pay it all back. So you write the 75-year plan, and to begin with, you phase in slowly benefit cuts, you phase in slowly tax rate increases, but you do enough of them not only to put it in balance, but also to pay off the debt. My view is it's the last of these is what will happen. First of all, the idea of letting Social Security borrow is not new. The Clinton appointed panel, which came up with 3 separate plans. One of them, the one that had individual accounts, recognized you get a cash flow problem if you have individual accounts, because the money that was being used for benefits is now going to the purchase of stocks and bonds owned by individuals. So they had borrowing from the public. The President Bush's commission to strengthen Social Security brought in individual accounts, and the only way they could make it work was letting Social Security borrow and pay back. Indeed, it was broader than that because many individual members of Congress and outsiders made proposals with individual accounts. And all of the proposals with individual accounts had a borrowing problem. And as you can see, the borrowing problems varied quite a lot in size. The biggest one was John Sununu, at that time senator in New Hampshire, and Paul Ryan, who is frequently referred to as a fiscal conservative. He wanted to borrow enough money so that in 2050, it'd be almost 100% of GDP added to the debts that were already there. The two bottom plans, the one I developed with Peter Orszag and the one Robert Ball developed, didn't have individual accounts, and the process of phasing in responses, because back in 2005, you had 30 years to phase it in, meant you'd have less of a hole if you were trying to pay the benefits in law. So is there a way to do better than periodically waiting for a crisis? So here we are 50 years after 83. You can say, gee, we got 49 pretty politically quiet years. Is that really the best way to go? I think the answer is no. And the model I want to briefly show you in my last 2 minutes is what they've done in Canada. The Canadian Social Security started up in the mid-60s, and to begin with looked a lot like ours. Since then, they've been making some changes. Two things they've done which, not necessarily precisely those details, but are the right kind of idea in my view. One is, instead of just holding government bonds, which is what they did to begin with, they set up an independent board with instructions to invest and heavily audited, and told it to slowly build up a fund out of the amount of payroll tax revenue they gave them each year, but also out of the returns on their investment. So Canada has a globally invested fund that looks just like the sovereign wealth fund of Norway with its oil money, or Saudi Arabia with its oil money, and in Canada it comes from the payroll tax and has been getting very high rates of return and takes on a lot of risk because this can fluctuate without impacting right away in any significant way the retirees or the workers. It impacts, but it gets spread out and moves slowly. The second thing they did to avoid the crisis, they do the actuarial evaluation we do every year, every third year. I don't see why we need to do it every year, but that's neither here nor there. And so the chief actuary of Canada comes out with a report. There isn't the shield or the lack of shield of having trustees the way the US system does. And he calculates what payroll tax rate is needed to keep the system going for 75 years. And if that's higher than the rate that's on the books, the tax rate goes up for part of that gap, and the cost of living adjustments don't happen. So that means they're smoothing out the need for dealing with a problem which they didn't think they had when the system was set up. They've got some other changes I won't go into. It seems to me that's the right way to go. It's called semi-automatic because the first thing they do is give government a chance to legislate a change. It's a bit complicated in Canada because the pension system is a joint federal and provincial program, and it's got to be approved by both the federal government administration and the ministers of the various provinces. That, it seems to me, is a really good way to go. So we get out of this periodic crisis, even if they are 50 years apart, because that, it seems to my mind, lends itself to crisis politics, which are often not very well designed. Last slide, last word, is a photograph from the Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C., and I think reflects FDR's view towards social policy. And so now we've got almost the scheduled time for Q&A. And
okay, so we're going to have 2 mics, one on either side, and we'll be passing it. So just raise your hand and we'll try to get to as many people as possible. Just one moment.
why don't you do Will Mush?
Okay. What about increasing the taking out more as the salary goes up? Do you not think that we should do more of that?
The maximal taxable earnings base, MTEB as it's commonly referred to, is commonly proposed to be increased. I wrote a book with Peter Orszag back during the Bush privatization campaign, motivated in part by the fact that there were people supportive of the commission who argued you couldn't come up with a reasonable plan without individual accounts. And so Peter and I sat down and designed a plan that would give 75 years of balance and would do it without individual accounts and doing the kinds of things that we thought were sensible. And that absolutely included 2 things. One was speeding up the increase in the maximum. So it would, you don't want to make a sudden move in it, because the people making $128,000, if they're living in a high cost of living area, they're well off, but they're not super well off. And secondly, we argued that, and this connects a bit with, but differently with what Larson did, Social Security from the beginning was set up to be only slightly funded. It wasn't set up as a funded system, and there were 2 political reasons behind that solution. From the point of view of the Republicans, their expressed concern was that if there was a big trust fund, you would want to invest it in the stock market and in corporate bonds, and then the government would have too much say about what was happening in the economy. Needless to say, the word socialism was thrown around in the 30s. On the Democratic side, there was an eagerness to have benefits grow right off the bat. Now, the same bill that created Social Security also created old age assistance, which became the SSI program. And to begin with, old age assistance was handing out more money than Social Security was. But the idea was to use the revenues to not start with a big payroll tax rate, but a low payroll tax rate that would be rising, and to use the revenues to boost the benefits for the early generations of retirees. The earliest ones had been through the Depression, and then there were a lot of people workers who had been in World War II, and so the argument for doing that approach was there. So you can ask, now, needless to say, if a bunch of generations get back more than could be financed by their own contributions, the later generations are getting back less than can be financed by their contributions. This is not an accident. This was the plan based on the expectation later generations would be better off. So the calculation was done. I haven't seen it updated. We're not at the verge of legislation, so the idea of tracking down every detail, is not on my agenda. But back then, it was estimated that the missing trust fund, because of the redistribution, amounted to basically 3 percentage points on the payroll tax. The whole deficit was that kind of number. And so the idea was that 3% came from supporting our parents and grandparents. And that's something that should be shared throughout the earnings distribution. So our proposal, in addition to slowly increasing the taxable base, was to put a 3% tax rate above that, for all earnings above that, based on this narrative of why it was there. Ballpark the same size as Medicare, which also has no limit on the earnings that are subject to it. So yes, that is a common part of many plans. I don't know why Larson didn't put it in. Part of it is you don't want to make your plan too complicated because you're in the political process. He wasn't expecting imminent legislation. He was doing this for a political stance and a political process. So he kept it simple, my presumption.
Professor Diamond, thank you for great research, great talk, and also this last slide about the distributed justice. My question is, in the era of artificial intelligence, robotics, and automation, does UBI, Universal Basic Income, does it make sense? And have you done any research? Have you looked at any kind of viable way of providing that UBI? Do you think that's a good way to go about it?
Okay. First of all, let me say I've glanced at it. It's not something I've dug into. I haven't looked at the anybody's financing plan in detail. The critical political question is, to what extent is the country willing to go along with the higher taxes that would be needed to do it? Keep in mind, we have been grossly underinvesting in infrastructure, in education, in basic research. Since ballpark 1980, the fraction of GDP devoted to each of those has been shrinking relative to needs. In my view, we need significant tax increases. Yes, there's a lot of spending that isn't as important as that. You could also finance some of it out of spending cuts. But we need significant more tax revenue. If the public was willing to go along with even more tax revenue, I think UBI is a terrific idea if the politics of it make it viable. It wouldn't be a terrific idea if it got in the way of infrastructure, of education, of R&D. If we could do it with financing those and that, yes, I think it has a lot of favorable things. A number of countries have what's called a non-contributory pension. It's basically UBI for everybody old enough. The Netherlands sets it just above the poverty line. So if you've been your whole life in the Netherlands, you've got an income flow that is above the poverty line. Needless to say, they don't have a whole lot of elderly poverty. New Zealand has one. A number of advanced countries do. A lot of less developed countries have them too, because administratively you can handle that. If you're trying to do what our Social Security does, you need a lot of complicated stuff. So this is a simple way of having a pension system. And doing that for the elderly is an idea in the US that goes back to Thomas Paine. He also wanted to give every 21-year-old a one-time shot. It was annual payments to everyone over 50 then, but every 21-year-old, man and woman, would get a lump sum to help finance launching of their careers.
So obviously, you know, one of the pillars of democratic society is an informed electorate, but
Good luck.
clearly this stuff that, right, well, that's just exactly my point. I mean, we're talking about concepts that are complicated for the average citizen. Just the question, you know, just the concept of the time value of money is, you know, clearly folds into this and so on. So I sort of would like to get a sense of your view of the educational component in terms of our education as a citizenry, not just in STEM, but also in social sciences and economics in particular.
Let me focus more narrowly on what can be done to get the views of the public, which I showed in the opening slides, have the kind of impact on Congress we would like. And I think there are two parts to it. One part is a sustained campaign of, at a time when it's politically live, of trying to inform the part of the public that's paying attention. And that's what President Clinton did with extended travel and extended TV appearances talking about Social Security. I was on a panel with him for national television at one point. And that isn't what President Obama did, because at that time it was tied up in the grand bargain and so many other things at the same time. So that's one of the things. When we get there, the hope is we will have leadership that will be explaining it well. The second thing, to my mind, is to try to focus on a readily understood, if imperfectly understood, difference. So I think we need a commission. I think we need a commission which, like the base closing commissions, is not made up of members of Congress, but made up of people from outside, representing stakeholders, but also representing expertise. And got to have an up or down vote in Congress, so it's got to be politically acceptable. But secondly, it's got to have a specific charge that Congress votes. So again, base closing commission is told, close enough bases to save this much money. You decide which bases. Obviously, restore 75-year actuarial balance is the basic instruction. It's not enough of an instruction. I would like to see the instruction include, along the lines of one of my earlier slides, when you get there, roughly X% has to come in things that directly affect beneficiaries, and 1 minus X%, or you can add some other little stuff, as in the past, has to come out of tax revenue increases. And let's get the public will understand. Is this going to be 50-50? Is it going to be 60-40? Is it going to be 100-0? That, I think, converts a very complicated issue into something that gets to the two sides. Too much of our discussion looks at spending without taxes or looks at taxes without spending. It's only when you put the two together, as Social Security does, that you get more balanced answers. So I'd like to see the plan for a commission. I'd like to see an election where people are being asked, we're going to set up this commission, how are you going to vote for these percentages? How much of an impact that will have, I don't know. I'm an economist, not a political scientist.
One thing that's clear is that you're projecting out 75 years, and that means you must know how long we're going to live in 75 years, as well as what income we're going to make and what our population growth is going to be. So I'm wondering, you know, how do we make these projections of, you know, average lifespan in 75 years? Because if, you know, we're all going to be, if everyone's going to be retiring at 67, it does create an issue of pay for another 67 years of
Right. Let me say, of course, you're right. The future is particularly hard to predict. We have a lot of trouble understanding history, but the future is harder. But you can't say, I don't know, we'll just figure it out when we get there. You've got to be preparing. And preparing says you form the best view of it you can. And the Office of the Actuary, and a bit CBO, but less so, works very hard at drawing on the expertise around it. So we have a history of projections of life expectancy. They've been doing this for years. Do they get it just right? Of course not. Do they recognize more or less the kind of trend we've had? For that, yeah. When they talk about labor force participation rates, they got it consistently wrong about the growth of women in the labor market and how that affected Social Security. You won't get it right, but you'll get some ballparks. On life expectancy, there's an ongoing debate among demographers and between demographers and actuaries as to whether there's a limit on life expectancy. 115, it'll never go above that, or pick some other number. And so far, that's just a heated debate, and the Office of the Actuary picks the numbers for its simulation that are very much within the range in which ongoing debates go on. And one of the things they do is they appoint a technical panel every couple of years to review all of their technical stuff. Are they, first of all, making the right assumptions? Secondly, are they running the right kind of model? So they have, much more so than many other countries, a highly credible process in the sense that it's not as open as it might be, but it's very open and very much influenced by academic debate and professional consulting debate, actuaries, demographers, economists.
Yeah. When I look at Medicare, it has a thin veneer of means testing buried in it. I think about 9% of the population gets hit with a increased fee for Medicare. Is there any possibility that we could close some of the gap with a means testing program so that the Donald Trumps of the world are not necessarily eligible for Social Security?
First of all, in Medicare, it's the same insurance policy for everybody. It doesn't mean everybody uses it the same. The only study, I'm sure there are studies, and I'll bet it's the case. I know this was the case in the one study I saw for Israel. Higher income people actually make more use of expensive medical services than lower income people, and they live longer. But Social Security, I showed you the benefit formula. The benefit formula is already designed to give much larger benefits to low earners than high earners. And the question is, would it be a good thing to move beyond just putting more tilt in that formula? Common proposal is to lower that 15% in the top arm to 10. Would it be better to go beyond that and also look at the income people have at the time? That would be how you'd have to do for means testing. And going back to the beginning, that was resisted on political grounds. And what I think of is the expression of Wilbur Cohen back when he was a cabinet member. In the US, a program for poor people is a poor program. Consider the difference between Medicaid and Medicare. And the concern is, if Social Security were seriously means tested, then the political support for it would start fraying. The extent to which that's true depends how far you go, but also the extent to which you save money depends on how far you go. Canada has a benefit that goes to almost everybody. but the top 5% of income people don't get it. Of course, if you're taking it away from the top 5%, you're not saving a whole lot of money. So the issue, to my mind, is heavily on two things. One is the political side. The other is, would you rather have a more progressive benefit formula and not be discouraging saving for retirement and continue to earn in retirement by lowering benefits based on income at the time? Because you could get the same degree of progressivity, not identical, but more or less within the program as from outside. I think that's a complication that's probably not worth going to, putting the two economic and political arguments together.
So what exactly is the source of the funding gap? And if it's an imbalance between retirees and workers due to the baby boomers retiring, is it possible to reach a new sustainable equilibrium in the future? Or another way of asking the question is, why is this a long-term problem?
It's a long-term problem because in 1983, they projected that they'd done just enough for 75 years. They understood at the time the 76th year would be a problem already because they were limited as to how much they wanted to push up taxes and slow benefit growth as a political decision. It seems to me we've got the problem after 50 years rather than 75 because the economy evolved differently than was projected in 1983. I'm guessing, I haven't looked to see which were the pieces, the earnings grew a lot faster relative to inflation from the end of World War II into the mid-70s. And from the mid-70s to now, we've had a distinctly lower productivity growth, a lower wage growth. And so that, I'm guessing, is the big part of the story. Going back to the earlier question, the future is very hard to predict. But Social Security is, forget all the detailed rules, at bottom, very simple. It's money in and money out, and interest earned on the trust fund insofar as the money is coming in sooner. And if you want to restore it, you either need more money in or less money going out. I mean, this is not rocket science.
We have revenue loss due to job losses to the trust fund. Now, if you used Trump import duties to put in, would that have a balancing feedback effect to stabilize the trust fund?
I haven't seen that one analyzed because the thing about tariffs is they hit both ways. They affect imports and exports, in part because the value of the dollar changes with the change on one side or the other. The one thing that has been evaluated is if we don't extend DACA, there's a whole lot of people who otherwise would be earners paying taxes first and getting benefits later who won't be there. Just as the annual projection looks at its estimate of immigration and says if we have more immigration, Social Security is in better shape. If we have less, it's in worse shape. That's familiar numbers on size and effect. Some people think, oh, well, we can solve the problem that way. We can't. It's not that big an effect, but it's noticeable. That's the one piece that I have seen actually evaluated in the literature.
Okay, we're going to have questions for about 15 more minutes, but if you do need to leave and you want more information about future series, there's a sign-up sheet here, and I think I saw a hand somewhere up over here.
There's a mic over there.
Oh, yeah, hi, thank you. I just want to understand a little better about a very basic question. So if somebody never works, like if they either have inheritance or have savings and they become 65 and now they're indigent, but they've never put into the system, they get nothing, is that correct?
Assuming we're talking about a single person.
Yeah, single person.
That is correct.
Okay.
They'd be eligible for SSI, which is a program for poor people. But you don't get anything from Social Security unless you have at least 10 years, 40 quarters, because it's measured by the quarter, 40 quarters of contributions, where a contribution is defined as at least a certain number of dollars.
Okay.
And that goes up each year with.
Okay,
with
so my
wages.
second point is, so let's say a worker, is like 25 years old, let's say he gets a job and he gets paid, just for round numbers, let's say 100,000 a year. So he has to pay, let's say for round numbers, 6,000, and his employer pays 6,000, that's 12,000 a year. And he works for about 40 years, so he's paid about 480,000 into the system. I mean, it seems to me it's against his freedom to confiscate 480,000. He should be offered, George said in his most recent lecture, he showed that over 40 or 60 years, an index fund goes up 7% a year. That 480,000 could be worth, if you probably calculate it, 2, 3, 4 million by the time he retires. So don't you think it would be a good idea to let him opt out? Say to him, look, when you get 65, you get no Social Security at all. But you can take your 480,000, turn it into the 3 or 4 million, spend it, and it just seems to be an encroachment of freedom to confiscate that kind of money from that worker. He should be allowed to opt out if he wants to.
Okay, let me speak to three things you raise. First of all, the vocabulary of freedom. I'm a consequentialist. I want to ask, what happens if you have something like that? The concept of freedom, I was just reading a book on the tension between FDR and Chief Justice Hughes in the 30s. I had no idea that Supreme Court had said minimum wage is unconstitutional because it cuts into freedom. Maximum hours for children and women is unconstitutional because it cuts into freedom. I'm a consequentialist. I think that's not a useful argument. Obviously, there are places where freedom is the right vocabulary. This isn't one of them. If we have individual investing, some people will do very well, lots of people will do very badly. Even in places where it's a mandatory investment and you get to choose what you want, but you don't get to choose how much you have to put away, an awful lot of people choose very badly. The financial market is not a simple idealized economics demand and supply market. And so I think that would be a terrible idea. What I like in your proposal is if instead of Social Security only holding Treasury bonds, it was doing what Canada is doing and investing with higher rates of return, that would give your same guy a better return on his investments, obviously with some risk taken on. You don't get higher returns without, expected higher returns without risk. But I think that would be a worthwhile trade-off for Social Security. So I'm accepting your view that those better investments are a good idea. I'm also saying there is this hole in Social Security that went to our parents and grandparents. I can put it that way because I think I'm at the cusp generation. I was born in 1940, and I think we more or less broke even on average. Somebody has to pay for what isn't there. And if your guy gets to invest his money elsewhere, he or somebody else is paying a whole bunch of taxes anyway, if we're going to go on paying the benefits that were in the law based on the taxes that have been paid. It isn't costless to let them go away.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. I just turned 62, so I'm eligible to take out Social Security now. Or other friends have told me to wait until I'm 70 and then I'll get a better return on my money. So I'm just wondering which is the better, from what you've said tonight, I might only get 5 years of Social Security before I die. I don't know if I wait till I'm 70. I'm just wondering.
First of all, there isn't a single right decision for everybody. If there was, we wouldn't have that much choice. We have that choice because it's different for different people, depending on how much they need cash up front, depending on how long they expect to live. What is, to my mind, a mistake is thinking about it as an investment. Is this a good investment? The way to think about it is it's insurance, because what you're buying with delay is an annuity. It will give you higher money as long as you live. That's insurance against, heaven forbid, you live a long time. And just as you can say, oh, I bought fire insurance on my house and it didn't burn down, what a waste. You wouldn't say that. But you've got to say, this is insurance. I think of it as insurance, but like any other insurance, it has a price. Given my circumstances, is this a price worth paying? That's the question you need to ask.
With driverless cars coming and many other disruptions from computers taking over many jobs, how is that going to change the equation of money coming in from wages versus from other sources?
That's a tough call. The issue is hotly debated around the expression which in business cycle terms is always a sign of disaster. This time is different. Of course, we have had massive technical change repeatedly in history, and the adjustment to it is tough on the people who are adjusting, but lots of other jobs get created. So to what extent this will impact wages, we've already seen a shrinkage of the fraction of total income going to wages. And I don't know how much of that is technical progress, how much of that is the change in the relative power of capital and labor, in part from globalization effects, in part from legislation, in part from the growth of corporations relative to the market generally. There's something there. There's no question about it. And one could certainly consider tapping some other source of revenue, just as Medicare under Obamacare has a tax in it that isn't just on earnings. So I think that's an open question. I don't think it's a question that we should be attempting to answer now, because I think there's too much uncertainty about it. But if it comes about like that, then yes, we would need to change something, because we'd want to give people adequate retirement incomes.
Thank you for a great talk. I have one question for you, and that's about one of the early slides that you had about the different perceptions of Social Security and different demographics. And I'm speaking particularly about the demographic, the sort of 20 to 30, 30 to 40-year-old cohorts, which I would say are underrepresented in this room, but who are critical to the question of political support for Social Security, or Medicare for that matter, going forward. And I wondered if you could comment on that. Thank you.
Part of the widespread support for Social Security generally comes from awareness, including young people, of its role for their parents and grandparents. So I think it would be a mistake to think these people are just calculating what's in their own interest. I think they've been scared. I mean, there are lots of things to be scared about. But I don't see the opposition to some form of rescue being a widespread phenomenon.
Shortly before we came to this meeting, we were watching PBS, and there was a spot on the 6 o'clock news regarding a referendum in Maine, which has to do with supplementing for people over 65 free in-home health care, and whether the citizens of Maine would support that. And the feeling was that this was a very good idea, and I was wondering if a program like that could help with the Social Security blanket as well, to have another type of help. The question is, where is it going to come from, the money? And what's proposed is that those who earn in the state of Maine something like $120,000 a year would then be taxed approximately 3.5% to cover this program. The downside is, if you know you're going to be moving to Maine and earning $120,000, would you then think twice about coming to Maine? But I think that I'd like to hear your comment about a proposal such as this.
First of all, I don't have any expertise on the healthcare side of spending. The issue, which is always an issue, when it's hard to raise tax money, if you're raising it for this, you're not raising it for that. And this certainly sounds like something worthy. How it stands up against other uses, it's just something I don't know. In many countries, and the US is a prime example, we have very limited support for the long-term care needs that are really very wide. This seems to me to be a piece of that. As a general proposition, if you do something at the national level rather than the state level, you get less of a response relative to the tax side of it, because it's one thing to move from Maine to New Hampshire. It's a different thing to leave the country to avoid taxes. And, you know, some people do it. There's some of it. There are baseball players who don't want to play in Canada because the taxes are higher. So it's real. But that means you've got to pay attention to your alternatives. And I don't know nearly enough to have an opinion whether it's a good idea or not.
Okay, we have time for one last question, then George is going to make an announcement. So we have
So slightly meta question. So some of the things that you've said suggest that you believe that there's I won't call it a simple answer, but a workable solution in an apolitical climate. So you've been at this for over 40 years, I think. What gives you the energy to keep fighting the fight throughout that entire period?
Oh, that's easy. It's fun. And also, as I've said, I think when it comes to crunch, something will happen. And what happens will be influenced by the generally accepted views around what's good design and what's bad design. I mean, they'll never get it all right. That's asking too much. But the political process, and I saw some of this with the Bush Commission. They started out where the general view was there's a particularly good way of doing the individual accounts. And then there was an academic literature pointing out that that wasn't such a good way. There was a different way of doing it that would be better. Now, I don't need to go into any details. The point is, when something becomes widely accepted, that is not so much the more or less fight, but how to do what you're doing better, then you can have influence. One of the things that I live with is you can never know if what you did actually made a difference or not. So I tell myself it did.
I want to thank you very much for your presentation and for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us. It's certainly a treasure to have you here. I'd like to tell you a couple of things. One is a sign-up sheet back there, and for these lectures, if you want to put your name on your email on there, then you'll be on a list that gets notices from me, and it stays with me. As you know, well, you may not know, but we have been doing during the daytime programs at the community center for the past year. This year, we're doing these programs in the evening at Cary. And so in the spring, we have Alan Sinai, who will be talking to you about our economic progress on the cycle, so when you're going to go broke and when you're going to get rich. Also in the library programs, in the community center, the programs are economics and finance. Here, what we're doing is economics and science. So Bruce Cohen will be here to talk about his research and what's going on today with the brain and the research in the brain that has to do with mental health. And it's a fascinating piece of science, and I think very close to home for many people. And then we're putting together a program which I haven't got quite pieced together yet, but we are hoping to present to you a program on Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, and it's a rather complicated picture, but we're hoping to have that program as well. So that's what we have working for the spring. So with that, thank you very much for coming to our first program. And